Hi everyone. Our discussion in this video will be devoted to South Africa during the Second World War. This is a pivotal time for South Africa, a time of some uh, tremendous social and economic changes, but also a transitional period in politics because it's right after the war that the National Party comes to power and apartheid is put into place. And so we need to deal with the reasons for that. In 1939, when the war started, and Britain, of course, declared war on Germany after Germany invaded Poland. South Africa, as still technically a British possession, was left in a difficult position because, of course, the Afrikaner population was opposed to fighting on the side of the British. They were still considered the enemy. The memories of the South African War were still very present in the Afrikaner mind. And culturally and even politically, many Afrikaners felt a great kinship with Nazi Germany. There were even, organizations that had arisen in the 1930s among the Afrikaners that mimicked, in some ways, things like the Hitler Youth and the SA and things like this, right? So they admired Hitler, they admired the Nazis, not universally necessarily, but many did. And so when the decision came before Parliament of whether to join the cause, there were sort of two camps, or actually there were three. Herzog, who was still the prime minister, called for South Africa to remain neutral in the war. He was an Afrikaner, of course. Jan Smuts, the most British-friendly of all Afrikaners, again, as we've said, educated at Cambridge University, had long-standing ties to Britain. He called for them to declare war on Germany and to do their duty for the British Empire. D.F. Malan, who was now the head of the National Party, called for South Africa to declare war on Britain. Right. The National Party was still a fairly minor player in national politics, and so that was not really a tenable position. So it really came down to debate between Herzog and Smuts and their two positions. Parliament chose very narrowly to support Smuts's position and to join the British in the war. Herzog appealed to the Governor General of the British Empire, asking for a new round of elections in South Africa, for there to be an early election for a new parliament, thinking that if he could do this, that he could stir up sufficient support that a newly elected parliament would countermand the decision of the previous one, and South Africa would not have to go to war. When the Governor General refused this, Herzog stepped down from his position as prime minister, and Smuts became the new prime minister and served as that during the war. Okay, so South Africa went rather reluctantly into the war. By the end of the war, over 200,000 South Africans were in uniform. A little over 5,000 South Africans died. The majority of the soldiers were white, but there were a significant number, tens of thousands of both black and colored troops. These were dispersed throughout the white units, mostly as laborers and cooks and other things. Some of them were trained as gunners, a fact that Malan in particular decried, talking about criticism of what he called Kaffir soldiers. This was abhorrent to the Afrikaners, that the blacks would fight on the side of South Africa, that they would be given such a privileged position to do that, right? And so the war did continue to stir up these animosities among the Afrikaners. The war period was a boon for the South African economy. Even though gold mining, which was still the largest sector in the South African economy began to decline slightly during this period. Not as much demand for gold. Other sectors more than made up for the losses in the gold mining. South Africa also has a lot of coal deposits, and so coal mining was important. There were other minerals, including things like uranium, that South Africa contributed to the Allied cause. But even more productive was the industrial sector, the manufacturing sector. The South African economy grew in large part because things like the garment industry, supplying clothing to Allied soldiers, even food and other amenities to the soldiers. The South African factories contributed a great deal to this. Women went to work as they did in other parts of the world, but in addition to that, large numbers, a larger influx than ever of African laborers made it into the cities. To the point that Smuts and his deputy Hoffmeyer and others, even who were in support of segregation, certainly, began to talk about the necessity of removing some of the color barriers that the government really couldn't do anything about this influx of blacks into the urban environment. Right by the end of the war, about a quarter of all black Africans lived in the cities. Now that may not seem like a lot, but that number of black Africans exceeded that of the whites who lived in cities at about a 75% rate. Right, so urban expansion continued a great deal in this period. Now, where did the blacks go? They weren't allowed to live in the cities. This map is demonstrative of this, right? If you look at all of the boxes in blue here, you will see that each one of these represents a township, okay? And this map is from a bit later after apartheid is put into place. But you can see how many townships there were around Johannesburg. The largest by far of these was Soweto, and we'll talk more about Soweto when we talk about apartheid. But there were lots and lots of others, right? Extending all the way down to Vereeniging and Vanderbilt Park, out into the kind of gold mining regions to the west of Johannesburg. Some of these are spelled wrong, by the way. That should be Kagiso, Kagiso, word that means peace in Tswana. And then all of these around Pretoria as well, right? Mabopane and Garankuwa, Mamelodi, Attridgeville, Salisville. I mean, these were all initially kind of squatter settlements, but eventually the Africans there built more permanent housing, or in some cases the government gave in and built housing for them, right? So the Second World War period sees a great increase in this. Now, there was a great deal of white resistance to Africans coming in increasingly large numbers into the cities. The organizations that saw to the continuance of white privilege, both government entities and entities within mining and manufacturing, continued to suppress opportunities for Africans, continued to reserve all skilled positions for whites, and to make sure that there was a huge gap even between the pay of even unskilled white laborers and black laborers, right? So, I mean, they didn't open up the economy to black Africans, certainly. But nevertheless, there were, many of these Africans seized the opportunity to do this. An increasing number of African women migrated into these townships as the attention of the government was elsewhere. And so really for the first time, whole families were able to live in the cities. And that's a trend that would continue, right? And the black Africans have become more and more entrenched in these townships. There were a lot of business opportunities that enterprising Africans were able to exploit, right? With the growth of the townships, and with the utter lack of any kind of infrastructure or economic support for the townships coming from the white community or from the government, black entrepreneurs opened things like, well, informal establishments. One of the most obvious institutions in the township from this period on was this thing called the shebeen. Shebeen is a sort of combination rec hall, bar, in some cases even like a brothel, a disco. This is a place where people went, and especially men went, to drink, to play games, to seek sexual liaisons, and so forth and so on. Okay, so the shebeen is a really kind of fundamental institution, and it will remain so during apartheid. But informal businesses like buying up food and I don't know, sweets and newspapers and things like this, and going out into the township and selling them at these, what amounted to just little stands, right? In townships, these come to be called tuck shops. And they're eventually just all over the place, right? And there's little monitoring on the part of the government of these informal establishments. But enterprising black Africans were able to take advantage of this and do pretty well for themselves. Life in the township. This is a theme that we want to pay attention to as we go forward. It's in my mind one of the more fascinating aspects of this and the period that follows, the apartheid period. Townships come to have a real kind of civic spirit to them, in a sense, right? Once, and we'll see this with apartheid, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, right? But people come to associate themselves with these communities rather than, with the traditional areas from which they came, the rural areas. There is still a lot of traveling back and forth between the reserves and the townships, but people come to consider themselves to be inhabitants or residents of Soweto, or Tembisa, or Alexandra, or Sharpeville, or Mabopane, or any of these places, right? So, and there are kind of informal governing type associations that spring up in these places, businesses. People really make a life there, and they even start to be able to live as whole families, and to mix. I mean, really for the first time, I think, in a long time, people of different ethnic groups mixed in the townships. Sutu and Swana and Zulu and Xhosa and Pedi and Venda, right, all came together in these townships, and the government, did not want this to happen, and they take steps to try to prevent it in the apartheid period. So we'll talk more about that. In the mines and in the factories, Africans really made attempts, in some cases pretty successful attempts, to organize their labor and to be represented by unions. In the 1940s, during the war, for instance, the government kept increasing bus fares because the living situation in a place like Johannesburg creates a lot of transportation problems. If a laborer in Soweto or in Lenasia or in Mutlakang or a place like this has a job in a factory in Johannesburg, well, I mean, they're going to have to travel something like 20, 30 miles in some cases to get to work every day, right? Well, the city supplied buses from the townships to the factories, but they kept raising the bus fares. Now, the initial response of the Africans to this was to boycott. And they did this successfully, and even got the government and the associated entities to back down from their attempts to raise the bus fare. Eventually, it's just going to be mostly an informal, again, an informal business economy that rises up to take care of the transportation. But we'll have to track that into the apartheid period. So this is successful. One that is not, and really the, I could say, most important piece of organized labor in this period is a massive mine workers union strike that happens in 1946. So this is right at the end of the war. And these African miners refused to work. Gone were the days when they could just bring in Chinese laborers like Alfred Milner did 40 years before. The mines needed the African laborers, and so they were in a position of some strength there. And they made demands for higher pay and family housing for entire families. The benefits like paid leave, better food provided to them, and so forth and so on. The Chamber of Mines, with the support of the government, Chamber of Mines was the controlling kind of bureaucratic body of the mining industry. They issued a declaration, and I'm just going to go ahead and read the section from it's quoted in the Thompson text. The gold mining industry considers that trade unionism as practiced by Europeans is still beyond the understanding of the tribal native. A trade union organization would not only be useless, but detrimental to the ordinary mine native in his present stage of development. Close quote. This is the ploy used so commonly, and we're going to see it used continually again in the apartheid period, that when Africans organized themselves, when they made demands, they were always told, well, that those kinds of demands that you're making are really for people at a higher stage of development than you are, right? In this case, it's very convenient for the Chamber of Mines to say, oh, a trade union is something that only Europeans can have because an African is not advanced enough in his development to even understand what a trade union is. So it's going to be detrimental to his development to allow them to have an organization like this. Well, that's all very convenient to simply deny the Africans any ability to organize, any ability to make demands through a union, right? The Chamber of Mines wins a great victory in this, and organized labor among Africans in general really takes a hit as a result of this. The mine workers were forced back into the mines, sometimes at bayonet point. A number of them were killed. I think about 1,200 of them were injured in the fighting, but ultimately the mine workers were defeated and forced back into their jobs without any increase in pay or benefits or anything like that. We mentioned the political split over the issue of the war and the formation of the Oseva Brandwag in an earlier lecture, but let me return to that. The Oseva Brandwag, that means Ox Wagon Sentinel. This is a secretive organization. It ended up involving many of the most prominent Afrikaners, but also had a kind of rank and file membership, which came to include tens of thousands of people ultimately during the war. Right, it was modeled after the Sturmabteilung, the Nazi paramilitary organization, before that was supplanted by the SS, So, the National Party had a militant wing, so to speak. The Oseva Brandwag did carry out some acts of sabotage against the South African government, but for the most part, they did not openly attack South Africa, at least not militarily, right? They did rhetorically, certainly. The British alliance held all through the war. Jan Smuts, was the darling, so to speak, of the British in Africa. He did not personally lead troops, but he was supportive of the British cause during the war. And, as a result of the new economic conditions created by the war, the increased demand for products from South African factories and things like this, there was some easing of the color bar. Smuts and Hofmeyr and the others who were now in charge of the United Party um, saw this in a way as inevitable, even if they, felt that Africans were inferior as they did. There was some element of easing of this. At times, the pass laws were relaxed, only to be kind of started up again with vigor, right? So there's an inconsistency to all of this. But even those few instances of the easing of the color bar sent the Afrikaners who supported the National Party, and many of whom were members of the Oseva Brandwag, into a complete mental breakdown, right? This was unacceptable to them to talk about any restriction or any easing of the restrictions on Africans, right? Any effort to make the society more equal was most unwelcome. They were, in particular, and this is a picture of D.F. Milan, in particular concerned about black soldiers being trained even in combat roles in the war. This was unacceptable to them. And so after the war, I think probably in an effort to appeal to some extent to these hardliners, um, the United Party government sort of cracked down. The Natives Representative Council. This was the body that replaced the Cape Franchise that was extended to Africans. They, continued to elect representatives, but the representatives had to be white, and they then formed this body called the Natives Representative Council, which was supposed to give advice, be an advisory body to these representatives. Well, this had a membership which included many of the more prominent individuals among the African intelligentsia. Z.K. Matthews, who I talked about in an earlier lecture, who had law degrees or degrees from Columbia and Oxford, was a prominent member of the Natives Representative Council. This council called for reform in 1946, and essentially said we've got to put an end to this whole policy of segregation. In response to this, Hofmeyr actually attended the last meeting of the Natives Representative Council and essentially just denied that was necessary, made a speech and defended the government's racial policies. And in response to that, Matthews said essentially, well, there's nothing that this council can do then, if that's going to be your policy. The African National Congress supported the demands of the Natives Representative Council. And after that meeting in 1946, the Natives Representative Council never met again. It wasn't necessarily formally disbanded, but it was a defunct organization. As a result of all of the failures of the various representative bodies for Africans, there was a group of younger, educated, professional black Africans who were fomenting for change, who saw the old kind of guard of the ANC as out of touch, right? And they came to form this organization within the ANC called the Youth League. This is one of the more remarkable organizations of in South African history, and I would say in the history of modern Africa in general, right? It included such figures as Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu, who would end up becoming the key leaders in the fight against apartheid in the 1950s and 60s. And then, of course, in the 1990s as well. Mandela and Tambo, for instance, were partners in a law firm that they had started. They were both educated at Fort Hare University. and were practicing law. They began to use their abilities, so to speak, in the service of their fellow Africans as part of this ANC Youth League. And they traveled around. They met with other African leaders who were pushing for change, like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and Leopold Senghor in Senegal, and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Julius Nyerere in Tanganyika, who was a fellow Fort Hare University alum. This youth league really lends some vigor to the ANC. This is the thing that's really going to carry the ANC forward, as we'll talk about later. The National Party remained united under the leadership of Milan during this period, and really had themselves very well organized, so that by the 1948 election, they were poised to take charge of the government with the really out of touch nature of the United Party, presenting little by way of opposition to this. In 1946, as a way to sort of treat the issue, the key issue of race relations and the racial question, the National Party formed a committee headed by a guy named Paul Sauer, and they looked into the race question and essentially concluded that, the Sauer report is a contradiction. There are two things that it argues. One, that African labor needed to be abundant and needed to support white-owned businesses and white-controlled industry. But it argued at the same time that Africans should be limited to the reserves. They should be separated completely from the white community, right? Well, you can't really have both things. But that's what the Sauer report called for. An endless supply of cheap African labor to grow the South African economy and keep it in control of the whites, while at the same time, calling for blacks to be limited entirely to the reserves, to areas where they would be not a threat socially, politically, or economically to the white communities, who would control the vast majority of all of the land and economy of South Africa, right? The United Party had its own commission, and this was rather ineffectual. This was called the Fagan Commission, and it raised the pressing issue of white migration to the cities, and essentially said, this can't be stopped. It's just, there's too much momentum in this way, and practically speaking, there's no way to stop this. The Sauer report said, we've got to stop this. And there were Afrikaners who went even further than this, saying that whites needed to push all of the Africans into the reserves, keep them there militarily, force them to remain on that land, and learn to live without black labor. This was not seen as practical by the Sauer report, but the spirit of that contention was taken up by the National Party, right? So, in the 1948 election for Parliament, the National Party, with its solidarity, with its unified message, with its appeals, its kind of naked appeals to Afrikaner interests above all other things. This is politics of the base, if there ever was politics of the base. It won a victory, a narrow margin in Parliament. It was able to form a coalition with another Afrikaner party, which it quickly absorbed. But it actually only won the election because, as we talked about in an earlier class, the Constitution of South Africa held that there were these voting precincts that were not divided equally by population, or rather by territory. And so the rural vote meant more than the urban vote did. It was these rural Afrikaners who carried the day, so to speak. If the precincts had been divided up equally by population, the United Party would have won and continued to have a majority in Parliament, right? So D.F. Malan became the president, and they quickly put into position the system of apartheid. The chief architect of that was not Malan himself, but rather his Secretary of Native Affairs, Hendrik Verwoerd, who later became the prime minister. And we will talk about that in a future class.